Good morning or good evening, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the new English translation of Henryk Grossman's The Law of Accumulation and Breakdown of the Capitalist System. My name's Eleanor Morley. I'm a socialist activist in Australia, and I'll be chairing our panel discussion today. So this is the first full translation of Grossman's book into English. It's been translated by Jairus Banerjee and Rick Kuhn, who's also written an extensive introduction to the book. And it's been published by the Historical Materialism book series as a library edition in 2021 and by Haymarket in paperback in 2022. Now, it's been a very long wait for this book. It was originally published in German almost 100 years ago now in 1929 and has been a reference point in Marxist economic literature ever since then, even if often criticized. It was translated into Japanese, Serbo-Croatian, Italian, and Spanish between 1932 and 1979, now into English and also into Korean just this year too. So today on this panel, we're going to discuss what the book itself argues, the evidence for its ongoing relevance, how it came to be written, and then also our panelists' own paths to discovering the work of Grossman. And joining me on the panel today are Michael Roberts and Rick Kuhn. Michael is a British Marxist economist and the author of several books on Marxist economics and trends in the world economy. So to list a few of these, The Long Depression, published in 2016, World in Crisis, published in 2018, and Marx 200, published in 2018 as well. So his latest book is Capitalism in the 21st Century and was published just last year. In addition to writing all these books, Michael also blogs regularly on economics at thenextrecession.wordpress.com, which I highly recommend if you're trying to wrap your head around what's happening in the world economy today. Rick Kuhn is the editor of Henryk Grossman's works, and he has written a new introduction to each volume in the series. Rick actually won the Isaac Deutscher Prize in 2007 for his book, Henryk Grossman and the Recovery of Marxism, which is a fascinating study into the life and work of Grossman. Rick's also published on other aspects of Marxist theory and Australian political economy and labour history. And Rick has, in addition to this, been a union and movement activist for decades, and like myself, is a member of Socialist Alternative in Australia. So welcome to Michael and Rick. I will be timing this discussion today so that we have space at the end for the audience to ask your own questions to Rick and Michael. So please make sure you note any of these down if they arise in the meantime. Now, if I could get you to begin the discussion, Michael, by explaining why you think this book is important. And you'll have to unmute.
I started well by not unmuting myself. I'm supposed to be a professional at this by now, so that's not a good start. But let's see if we can make up for that by discussing the important elements of this book as far as I can see them. And there are so many that it's difficult to cover them all. But perhaps the crucial one to start with is in the title of the book itself, which is The Law of Accumulation and the Breakdown of the Capitalist System. And the bit that's often left out by people who criticize the book being also a theory of crises. And what Grossman is trying to point out here is that he sees Marx's theoretical explanation of the nature of capitalism as one where capitalism cannot proceed in a harmonious and expansive way without coming into a severe contradiction between the development of the productive forces and the profitability that comes into the hands and appropriated by the owners of the means of production, the capitalists. There's a fundamental contradiction between their ability to appropriate profits and the ability of the whole productive mechanism to meet the needs of humanity. And that contradiction is particularly expressed in Marx's law of the tendency of rate of profit to fall, a law which has come under severe criticism by not only people who oppose Marxist economic theory and socialism in general, they usually ignore it, but also by a whole galaxy of Marxists and people who claim to be Marxist in Henryk Grossman's time before him. If you read the book's early chapters, you can see he discusses all the different attempts to criticize his Marxist theory of what he calls a breakdown and of crises, and he wants to restore Marxist theory and law to explain it properly so that people can see how effective and relevant it is. I was just looking at, reminds myself in chapter 2, that if you look in chapter 2, when you read the book, there are two figures that Grossman presents to us to explain his theory. We have some graphics. One is a very simple one where the accumulation process of capitalism takes place, but because profitability is beginning to fall, then assuming nothing else happens, eventually there will be a breakdown because the profitability will fall to such a level that the further extension of investment, employment, and incomes will collapse, and capitalism will go into breakdown. But in the second graphic, he points out there are a number of counteracting factors that stop that immediate breakdown to take place. But in particular, it's crises themselves. Once capitalism goes into a slump and profitability falls and causes a slump, that slump creates the conditions for a reduction in production costs, both from workers being laid off and from other companies collapsing. And so the profitability rises again. So you get a rise, then you get a slump, a rise, and then you get a slump. So it's a cycle. It's a cycle of booms and slumps that the crises takes that form. I just want to show you whether that's actually true in the evidence that we can look at in real data that many Marxists have been able to compile over a recent period. So I'm just going to show you a couple of graphs to show you what I mean. So you can see here is a graph which is being prepared with my tail, as it were, fixing of it a little bit by Esteban Maito in Argentina. He shows in his excellent work on the historical transience of capitalism how the rate of profit, on average, he's got in 14 countries here, this is a world rate of profit, how over a long period of time, since when Marx wrote Capital in 1860s, up until the period when 1929, when Grossman writes this book, how on the whole there's been a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. So that first figure that Grossman presents in the book that's clear. There's a breakdown tendency led by the fall in the rate of profit. However, there are counteracting factors, in particular when slumps take place, which cause periods when profitability rises, as we can see in this graph. Particularly after the end of long depressions, you get recovery. Particularly in wars, you get high profitability.
30 seconds.
It comes down very sharply. If I focus just on the post-war period a little bit more, we can see even more clearly how that works and way which Grossman describes it. So those little S dots are when the slumps take place under capitalism. And we can see that the profitability leads to a slump. There's a recovery in profitability. Then the law of profitability operates again, causing another slump and then a recovery, and so on to where we are now. The general tendency continues downwards, but it's through a series of booms and slumps. That is the fundamental and most important thing that I think, which Henryk Grossman has provided a clearest explanation of for us to use and understand Marxist theory of crises.
Okay, well, if we could stay on some of these arguments for a little longer, and Rick, could you explain how it is that Grossman makes his case about this inherent tendency towards crisis under capitalism? You'll also have to unmute.
Grossman pays a major tribute to Rosa Luxembourg because Rosa Luxembourg insisted that capitalism tends to break down. And this was something that reformists in the international Marxist movement, in international social democracy, wanted to deny. They wanted to deny that there was a tendency to break down and a necessity of recurrent crises under capitalism. Grossman says, Luxembourg, spot on, she's a revolutionary, she's right. Crises are inherent, there's a tendency to break down, but she's not right in terms of the mechanism involved in this tendency that gives rise to economic crises. And Grossman takes as a focal point an argument against Luxembourg by Otto Bauer, the main theoretician of Austrian social democracy in the pre-war period, and for that matter, pre-World War I period, and for that matter, in the interwar period. Bauer set up an economic model which showed, or ostensibly showed, that capitalism could go on forever. Grossman actually looks at this model in more detail and points out that if you go beyond just 4 or 5 cycles in Bauer's model, the model actually breaks down, assuming that there is a constant rate of capital accumulation, a constant rate of investment compared with previous investments. And Grossman goes back to Marx's arguments about crisis in volume 3 of Capital. So he recovers Marx's theory of economic crisis in Capital, which had been not totally ignored, but not really appreciated by other Marxists between Marx himself and Grossman. And the argument is that crises are a necessary recurrent feature of capitalism. Capitalists compete against each other in the pursuit of profits by investing in more and more expensive machinery, equipment, technology, and raw materials, what Marx calls constant capital. They compete in other ways as well, but this is a crucial way in which they compete. That process of accumulation increases the weight of constant capital and increases the productivity of wage labour. That is the productivity of variable capital, which is measured in terms of outlays on wages. But it is only variable capital, human labour, that actually creates new value. And in proportional terms, this process of increasing the weight of outlays on dead labour, on constant capital, machinery, equipment, raw materials, and so on, compared with living labour, this means that the element in overall capitalist outlays that actually creates new value declines in proportional terms. And that leads to a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And that process is one that Marx identifies as a fundamental contradiction of capitalism. It's not something that occurs in the realm of circulation. It's not something that is dependent on levels of consumption. It is something inherent in the very heart of capitalist production, in the capitalist production process. It's something that is essentially unavoidable.
Okay, if this is an inherent tendency built right into the structures of the capitalist economy, then does that mean it's just one long downward slide for capitalism?
Well, as Michael said, there are important counter tendencies. So you can't just sit around and wait for capitalism to collapse, to break down. And although the accusation has been made that Grossman had a mechanical theory of breakdown, this is not the case. You have to actually analyse what is going on in the world and the extent to which these counter tendencies are actually taking effect. And the point of this is to identify circumstances in which the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism by the working class is most likely to emerge. Now, what sort of counter tendencies are there? Michael has already mentioned that economic crises themselves are a counter tendency. They tend to devalue capital. Bankrupt capitalists have to sell off their assets, or the people who get hold of those assets after they've gone bankrupt sell them off at a discount. And they can then be set to work again, but the cost to the new owners is less, and therefore the profits that they make out of it is reduced. Crises also undermine the bargaining power of workers because unemployment increases significantly, and therefore wages can be pushed down, and that increases the rate of surplus value, the rate of exploitation, and therefore the rate of profit. But there is also the inherent tendencies for the rate of profit to be maintained or restored. So as the productivity of human labour increases by using better technology, more sophisticated techniques of production, that will tend to cheapen the things that workers consume. If you're not stirring your batter to make bread or cakes by hand and are using a machine instead, then the amount of labour that will go into producing that bread will decrease, and the price of bread ultimately will go down. And similarly, if you're using more and more sophisticated techniques to produce constant capital, machinery and equipment especially, then their value will decrease over time. So that can slow down the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. There are also campaigns by capitalists to cut wages. They're always keen to cut wages and therefore increase their rate of profit. And there's a possibility of the emergence of new industries that are less capital intensive and therefore have a higher rate of profit. Imperialism and foreign trade can also help with the rate of profit by providing new or monopolised sources of cheap raw materials and cheap labour power. And there's a process of unequal exchange as well between industries and countries that have a lower capital intensive than others. There's a process where value is transferred from them to more metropolitan countries where what's called the organic composition of capital, the ratio of dead to living labour in capitalist outlays, is much higher. War can destroy constant capital, and preparations for war can slow down its accumulation by producing things that don't go back into the production process, either through the mouths of workers, what they consume in various different ways, not only eating, but also not producing things that go back into the production process as machinery and equipment or raw materials, but instead producing instruments of destruction. Capitalists may subjectively try to increase the rate of profit by reducing unproductive labour in their operations. So overall, we need to study what's going on with the rate of profit and try and work out the extent to which these mechanisms are actually operating or not. And we can't just sit around our hands under our bums waiting for the system to collapse.
Well, Rick mentioned that one critique of Grossman has been the argument that he had a mechanical read on the functions of the economy and crisis in the economy. I think another potential counter argument to him is that As I said in the beginning, this was written almost a century ago, and capitalism has arguably changed quite considerably in the 100 years since then. So, Michael, could you expand a bit more on whether or not his conclusions are actually borne out by the evidence in the economy today?
Well, as I showed in the graph, first of all, we can see from the actual empirical evidence that the profitability of the major economies in the world has fallen over a long period of time. There's a long-term tendency downwards for the rate of profit. So Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, tendency, which is counteracted by the counter tendencies that Rick has been describing, nevertheless, the tendency is the dominant force, and that we can see in the empirical evidence that the rate of profit has fallen over that period of time. The question then is asked, well, so what? Maybe the rate of profit is irrelevant to the health of capitalism, and what matters more is consumers spending more money so that capitalists can sell more goods, and that really we should be looking at questions like the efficiency of the economy in its productivity. Profitability isn't important. And that criticism and that sort of approach is what we've seen since Grossman, if not before, and particularly in the post-war period. We're struck by the fact that from the period of the late 1940s up until the mid-60s, we had in the major capitalist economies what is called a long boom, where capitalism expanded at a reasonably fast rate. We're talking about the advanced capitalist countries at 3, 4, or 5% a year. There appeared to be generally full employment. We had the development of the welfare state. Capitalism was a success. And the argument it was a success was because now policymakers and economists have worked out how to manage capitalism and make sure that it functioned in a harmonious and effective way. This was particularly based on the theories of John Maynard Keynes, who in the 1930s had advocated the idea of spending, government spending, and other measures to reduce the interest rates through monetary policy, and this would allow the capitalist economies to expand and get out of depression, which of course what he was worried about in the 1930s. So we were told in the 50s and 60s, of course I couldn't have possibly been around by then, but that capitalism had solved its problems through the management and Keynesian macro management. All that collapsed in the 1970s when the profitability went down really sharply, and suddenly the strategists of capital and economists realized that Grossman, he didn't use the word Grossman, but they realized that profitability was key and it could not be ignored, and that the ideas that you just have to get consumers to spend more would solve the problem have been proved totally wrong. These sorts of arguments had also been presented in Grossman's time, and that's what he was dealing with. Now we could say in modern period, at least in the latter half of the 20th century and into now, that we can see that, it's pretty obvious to anybody really, that if you have an economy driven by profit for capitalists, that profits must matter. And yet if you listen to economists in the consensus and the mainstream, they never refer to profits as being relevant to anything that's going on in the economy. And that is a crucial point to be making about the nature of this book and also Marxist economic theory. And when profitability fell in the 70s and 80s, they had to change their policy completely. The welfare state was attacked. The idea of macro management was abolished. We were supposed to have free markets. The phrase that academics like to use is neoliberalism. We dropped the idea of managing the economy and regulating it to deregulating it and not manage it and allow the market to expand. That, of course, we've seen now, for insofar as it improved the profitability of capital, it was very limited. And now we enter the 21st century and the profits rates are falling again. So Grossman's arguments, that which is the best and clearest explanation of Marx's arguments in volume 3 of Capital, have been proven correct as we go into this third decade now of the 21st century.
Thanks, Michael. And again, encourage people to pick up some of Michael's books where he essentially applies Grossman's theory of the rate of profit to actually understanding what's happened in the global economy, particularly over the last decade. But to move back to Grossman and the publication of the book. So the 1920s were obviously a very tumultuous time in politics, and this very much included the Marxist left, where there were a whole series of fractures, arguments, debates throughout that decade. So Rick, could you explain a little more about how Grossman came to write this book and how it was received at the time?
Sure. Well, I want to go back into Grossman's biography a little bit. If you want to know more details, then read my biography of Grossman, which I was trying to show you, but Zoom is too clever for me. Henryk, as a lad at high school, already got involved in the PPSD, the Polska Partia Socjalno-Demokratyczna. Apologies to Polish people who are watching. I know there are some. The Polish Social Democratic Party of Galicia and Silesia. So he was a Marxist from a very young age. And in 1905, he went on to be the founding theoretician and secretary of the Jewish Social Democratic Party of Galicia, because the PPSD which was becoming increasingly Polish nationalist, had ignored Jewish workers. And he was a very active political player, not simply a theoretician. In the post-war period, he went back to having lived in Vienna for a time. He went back to Poland, to Warsaw rather than Krakow, where he was born and grew up. It's worthwhile noting that the Austrian Social Democratic Party had played a role in Grossman moving back to Poland because it was part of a government that introduced racist policies designed to exclude people who had come to what was Rump Austria by then, in the period before and during the war. In Warsaw, Grossman joined the Communist Workers' Party of Poland and played an active role in the party, organising mainly educational type activities, for which he was jailed for different lengths of time, up to 8 months. He then went into a form of qualified exile in Frankfurt am Main in Germany, and was a member of the Institute for Social Research, the Institute for Sozialforschung, which gave rise to the Frankfurt School. I don't think you could say that Grossman was a member of the Frankfurt School. And it was in Frankfurt that he wrote his book, based on lectures that he gave at the university in Frankfurt am Main. So Grossman was still a Marxist. He was essentially a fellow traveller of the German Communist Party at this stage. That for reasons of his exile, he didn't join, but he was still a Marxist. He still identified with the party. But his theory of crisis was not amenable, was not acceptable to the Stalinizing Communist International or the Russian Communist Party, which dominated the International. Essentially, Stalin's lieutenant in economics, a guy called Jenő Varga, a Hungarian who was in exile in Moscow, he set out what the Marxist theory should be. And it was essentially a bastardized version of Rosa Luxemburg's underconsumptionist theory of economic crisis. And anybody who disagreed was obviously not a serious Marxist, was a revisionist, had a mechanical theory, and so on. So Grossman became disillusioned with the Communist International after the Nazis were handed power by the German ruling class in 1933. He drifted back towards support for the international communist movement subsequently, but he never resiled from his theory of economic crisis, which remained an anathema to the orthodox communist movement. Grossman's work was also rejected by the main social democratic theorists of the period. Rudolf Hilferding, whose work Grossman had criticised and was a major Marxist theorist in the period before, economic theorist before the First World War, Rudolf Hilferding did not reply himself, but there were 2 replies in the journal that he edited. And reformist social democrats didn't like Grossman's theory either, because it said that crises were unavoidable. That capitalism had this breakdown tendency and that there was no way of avoiding under capitalism periodic crises that led to the impoverishment of workers over significant periods of time and large numbers of workers. So they rejected his theory as well. And most left communists, with the very honourable exception of Paul Mattick Sr., also rejected Grossman's theory because they said, oh, it's mechanical. He just thinks that capitalism will break down itself. Well, if you read Grossman's book, then you will see that he did not have a mechanical theory. He insisted with Lenin, quoting Lenin, that there are no hopeless situations for capitalism, and that his theory, his analysis, was merely a means of identifying circumstances under which revolution may be more likely to be successful. So the reception was overwhelmingly hostile. There were lots and lots of reviews. Lots of people thought it was important to kick the shit out of this theory, either because it wasn't Stalinist or because it undermined reformist ideas. But it's not until really some elements in the Trotskyist movement, notably Roman Rozadolsky, revived Grossman's ideas, and also Paul Mattick Sr. played a very important role in publicising Grossman's ideas as well. So there's been much more interest in Grossman's work really since the late 1960s, and since Mattick's work, Marx and Keynes, was translated, well, was published in English in the late 60s, I think, and he's had much more coverage.
Great. I've got a copy here to spruik of your book if anyone wants to read more about the life of and work of Henryk Grossman. I highly recommend this, but also the introduction that Rick has written to the book that we're discussing today includes a bunch of this biographical and political detail as well. So we'll conclude this part of the discussion shortly so that we can move on to questions from the audience. But before we do, I'd first like to hear about how the both of you discovered Grossman and the arguments that he makes. So starting with you, Michael.
Well, I suppose I was one of those confused young Marxists interested in economics back in, well, a long time ago. And in that time, I was not clear on what the theory of crises was. Obviously, if you're a Marxist and revolution, you believe that capitalism has to go and has to be replaced. But what are the economic foundations for that contradiction that could bring that about? And there, I think at that time, generally there was a confusion amongst Marxist economists and others about the nature of the theory of crisis. Even if you read several books now, even now, a lot of very erudite Marxist economists will tell you there is no Marxist theory of crisis. It's just, it's a mishmash and we don't know what it is. But generally, the dominant view was that the reason we had crises under capitalism was that workers couldn't buy back all the goods that were being produced. There was an underconsumption. In other words, workers could not buy them all back, and therefore there was a chronic underconsumption nature to capitalism, which will bring about a crash and a breakdown of capitalism. It wasn't very convincing to me. Anybody who reads volume 3 of Capital can see that Marx and Engels as well completely trashed this theory by pointing out that, of course, that capitalism wouldn't even work because we know that workers cannot buy everything back. And it doesn't really explain the accumulation process in capitalism. To say that workers can't buy back all their own goods, all the goods that they produce, was a tautology, Marx says. It doesn't really tell you anything at all about the cause for crises, and it's permanently there. Engels said it's permanent underconsumption, so it doesn't explain why we have booms and slumps, because it's not a theory. So that's very confusing to anybody who's trying to understand that. But if you read volume 3 of Capital, Marx offers a very clear explanation for crises in the chapters of 13 to 15, describing this law of the tendency of rate of property fall, which most people, even in the days of the 50s and 60s and 70s, ignored, and as Rick said, didn't really take up as an alternative theory. So then at that time, the idea of workers having higher wages and government spending more to boost consumption was the dominant theory amongst conventional economics. It was Keynesian theory, and the other consumption theory really fell into that category to some extent as well. So it wasn't convincingly acceptable to me. Luckily, you're able to not only to read Marx to understand an alternative theory, but also, as Rick said, I came across the works of Paul Mattick, Marx and Keynes, which he mentioned, in which Paul took, of course, directly from Grossman, a very clear explanation of the nature of Marx's law of the tendency of rate of property to fall and why it is relevant to crises. So from Mattick and from Marx himself, I began to adopt that theory more seriously. And of course, actually, what brought me to Grossman was Rick's own biography book. Although Mattick is reference to Grossman is considerable in his work, Rick's own book actually brings it home to you much more clearly, both in his introduction and, of course, Grossman's work, which we're now discussing today. It's a seminal work on explaining the theory of crises in capitalism. It's indispensable for anybody who wants to understand this properly, and that brings you forward. My work since then is, in a way, not trying to prove the theory or to say the theory isn't logically consistent. It is very logically consistent. A lot of my work has been engaged in trying to empirically validate that theory in the material, because not much empirical work was done until the last 25 years on this, even though Grossman attempts it insofar as he has any data to work with in his book itself. So that's how I came in through a process, if you like, from anti-Keynes to Marx to Mattick to Rick.
Thanks, Michael. Now, Rick, it's obviously no great secret that you have had a keen interest in Grossman for some time, winning the Deutsche back in 2007 for your biography of him. So what was your path to Grossman's works?
My path was, I was a young economics student at Sydney University, involved in a struggle for courses in radical political economy. And I read what tolerably widely, including Marx, but other things as well. And what was important for me was a brilliant essay by the US economist Anwar Shaikh in 1979, an essay which is worth reading now on the history of crisis theory, where he vindicates Grossman's position. And I thought, oh, well, that's really interesting. And the British Marxist Chris Harman also made reference to Grossman's work, and the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain its economic theory is along those sorts of lines as well. Then in 1992, Jairus Banerjee's abridged translation of the Law of Accumulation and Breakdown was published by Pluto Press. Jairus had translated the book for study purposes in India in 1979. It didn't come out, it for mass consumption until 1992. In the late 1980s, I learnt German, having done 3 years under a relic of the Holy Roman Empire of the Holy Roman Empire of the German Reich at school, which didn't get me very far, but I studied German for 3 semesters at university and developed a sort of basic proficiency in Germany, and thought, well, this Grossman stuff looks interesting. And that set me off on the course of Henryk Grossman. And, well, I was involved in research for about 13 years to write the biography of Grossman. And that was essentially my path to Grossman's work. And like Michael, I agree, his study is a seminal one. And it's important as well in identifying different currents in Marxist crisis theory. Michael's mentioned that probably the dominant one, the underconsumptionist theory, that there aren't sufficient outlets for all of what capitalism produces to be valorized, to be sold off. But there's another current as well, disproportionality theory, which was really formulated primarily by Rudolf Hilferding. And Grossman takes aim against Hilferding as well. And Grossman's concluding chapter, which was entirely missing, sadly, from Gyrus's abridged translation, the concluding chapter is, to a significant extent, not entirely, but to a significant extent, a diatribe against disproportionality theory, which in the hands of Hilferding, who became on 2 occasions the finance minister of Germany under the Weimar Republic, became a justification for saying, well, if only the state intervened enough to maintain proportional output between different industries, then there need be no reason for capitalism to go into crisis. It could be onward and upward for capitalism. And Grossman points out that even if you have a significant degree or total control by government over the allocation of resources, even if you have the whole of the economy in the hands of government in one country, still crises will occur, because competition does not only occur within single countries. It's an international process, and all the more so today. And that's, the foundation for imperialism. So Grossman's book is an important theoretical contribution and also an important polemical contribution to revolutionary Marxist politics, to the understanding of the dynamics of capitalism today.
Great. Thanks, Rick, and thanks, Michael. I'm going to move on now to asking some of the questions that have been posted in the YouTube chat, beginning with, which seems to be the key topic of discussion there, the relationship between the rate of profit and the mass of profits, which is something that Grossman writes about. The question I'll start with specifically from Gary Roth is, didn't Grossman argue that the rate of profit was not the key variable, but just a barometer for the difficulties under which the economy functioned in terms of producing a sufficient mass of profit? And it's also come up with this comment from Nadia, pointing out that the various tech companies doing mass layoffs have mostly been posting profit, so their massive profits is growing, yet they're firing people. So maybe I'll start with Rick again, and then go to Michael. And you're on mute again.
For Grossman, the massive profit is important because to sustain even accumulation, it's important that there be sufficient amount of profit to be able to invest in the scale of machinery and equipment that is necessary for an increment in production, in output. And there is a significant tendency for the unit of additional investment that's necessary to sustain accumulation with new technology to get bigger and bigger. If you're using 19th century steelmaking production, then the scale of having a new blast furnace, the amount of value embodied in a new blast furnace is vastly less than the amount of value that's embodied in a modern blast furnace or electric oxygen furnace to produce your steel. And if the rate of profit is falling, then the scope for mobilizing sufficient capital to increase production on the basis of new, more expensive technology becomes more and more tenuous. So Gary's right. Grossman does emphasize the question of the mass of profit, but that cannot be separated from the issue of the rate of profit. The two are correlated. The mass of profit in Grossman's model does not fall. The mass of profit continues to rise, but the rise slows down, and the capacity of the increments in the mass of profit to satisfy the requirements of additional accumulation is progressively undermined. So, yeah, that's a first go at a response.
Michael, did you want to add to that?
Oh, yes, indeed, because I think this is quite a crucial question. Been a bit of a debate recently on the question of which is more important, the mass or the rate of profit. And I think Grossman is very clear, and Marx is very clear, that the two things are integrated together. They're integral to each other. The driving causal contradiction is the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which, as Rick has described before, is the organic composition of capital rises, and that's an inexorable process under the accumulation of capital in capitalism. It can be counteracted by a rise in the rate of exploitation, but overall, the long-term tendency, or the tendency over time, is for the rate of profit tendency to apply and to overcome the counteracting tendencies so that we get a fall in the rate of profit. As the rate of profit falls, then it's increasingly difficult to expand the mass of profit. But you can be in a period of years when the mass of profit is rising and the rate of profit is falling. That is not a contradiction. But underneath it, the rate of profit is beginning to drive down the ability of the mass of profit to continue to increase, or certainly not accelerate, slow down, and even stop. And Marx says that you reach a point, what he calls an absolute overaccumulation of capital, when the mass of profit actually falls because the rate of profit has fallen so much. And that is the trigger for a crisis and a slump. Actually, empirically, we can show that the mass of profit, if it slows down enough, will lead to a slump even before we get an absolute fall in profits. I've done it empirically. I can show of all the slumps since the Second World War up to now, 1 year before, the mass of profit slows down almost to zero and sometimes contracts. And that's when the kickoff of a slump takes place. So the two things are integrated together. And that's very important. And it'd be wrong, I think, to use the word barometer for the rate of profit and say the rate of profit is merely a barometer for what's happening with the mass. What the rate of profit has a tendency to fall and falls, and that causes eventually a complete slowdown in the mass of profit and even a contraction in the profit. The two things must go together in order to explain when we get the slumps. I have to say that It was a debate with David Harvey about this particular question a few years ago, historical materialism, where David, who doesn't agree with Grossman and Marx and the rest of us here that the law of the tendency rate of profit is relevant to crises, came up with the argument that what's much more important is what's happening to the mass rather than the rate of profit, and tried to make a distinction between the two. I said, you're shifting the goalposts now, David. It doesn't make any difference. I'm still going to score in your new goalposts because as far as I'm concerned, the two things are not separated. Marx called it a double-edged law, that as the rate of profit falls, the mass of profit can still rise, but eventually it will start to fall. And empirically, I think we can show that's correct. So it's a very important thing that Henryk Grossman explains in his book, and also is really a development of what Marx says in Capital.
Okay, another question, different topic that's come up in the discussion is about Luxembourg, who was Rosa Luxembourg and her theory of crisis, which was referenced in the discussion. And the question is, did Luxembourg not hold a view of a purely mechanical breakdown of capitalism? I guess jump in, whoever would like. Rick, yeah.
Yep. Well, Grossman says that, or writes that Luxembourg's approach tends to encourage a mechanical understanding of capitalist breakdown. I don't think that's entirely fair. I think that he's right to say that Luxembourg's explanation of crises and the tendency to break down is wrong and based on a very confused critique of Marx's reproduction schema in Volume 2 of Capital. But I don't think Luxembourg did have a mechanical theory. I mean, if you look at Luxembourg's practice, clearly she was not just waiting for capitalism to break down. She was a very active revolutionary and regarded the breakdown as something that might eventually occur when the whole of the world was overtaken by capitalism and there were no external sources of demand for what was produced in capitalist relations of production. But she argued that it was necessary for the working class to struggle for the overthrow of capitalism in the here and now, and she gave her life, literally, to that struggle as a founder, or as an opponent of the reformist currents inside the German Social Democratic Party, as a founder of the Spartakusbund, the Spartacus League in Germany, after the Social Democratic Party had put itself on the side of the German ruling class by supporting Germany's military efforts in the First World War, and then as the founder and leading theoretician of the KPD, the German Communist Party, and she was assassinated by forces who had been given authority by the Social Democratic government in early 1919. So Grossman has a huge respect for Luxembourg as a revolutionary and for aspects of her theoretical work, but he's critical of her crisis theory, which is expressed in her book, The Accumulation of Capital.
Michael?
I would just add that Rosa didn't accept or recognise the relevance of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, as most Marxists and Social Democrats at the time did not either. As I think Rick said in some of his introductory remarks, that they didn't appreciate Volume 3. A lot of them had never read Volume 3 because it really wasn't available to many in the movement at the time. And Rosa was searching for an explanation of why capitalism would go into crises, and to deal with, as Rick was saying, the people who claimed, the harmonists who claimed that capitalism could work if certain conditions were in place, in particular the reproduction schema, in which it was claimed that the reproduction schema showed that capitalism had an equilibrium that would work. In other words, that the proportions of the different sectors, in particular the investment sector and the consumption sector, could be kept in equilibrium and capitalism could progress. This was a theory from various harmonists like Baranowski and others, Hilferding as well. And Rosa was concerned to break that idea. And so she argued that if you look at the reproduction schema, Marx had missed the point that one would expand faster than the other, and that would create the conditions, if you like, of underconsumption, which could only be filled by going abroad into imperialism to find the third world people who were prepared to fill the gap and to consume the goods of imperialism. Apart from the fact I don't think the peasants of the third world were in a position to consume the goods of imperialism is an issue to consider. But the point that Grossman makes in his book is even if you accept that the reproduction schema are in equilibrium, he said, which is just a theoretical point really, but if they were in reality in equilibrium, there would still be crises, because that is not the reason for the crises. Crisis comes down to the profitability of capital. It's a fundamental thing if you think about it, that a profit-driven economy will go into crisis if profits aren't there. And that fundamental point is explained in a more sophisticated way by the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Unfortunately, Rosa did not appreciate that. In fact, when she was, as it were, taken up for the fact that she hadn't considered the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall by a Russian Bolshevik economist, she was a bit dismissive. She said, well, if the rate of profit is going to decide the theory of crisis, we'll have to, the sun will burn out before that's the case. And I think that's where she missed the point which Grossman explains so well in the book about the relevance of that law and its relation to breakdown and crises.
Okay, to move on again, we have a comment. It's not so much a question, it's a comment, but I thought maybe the two of you could comment in turn on that, which is more about this situation with the economy today and how these arguments about the falling rate of profit, but also the countervailing tendencies apply. So the comment from Brian is, in 2013, the global rate of profit using both fixed and circulating capital as the denominator began to fall. By 2019, it was down 40%. And this is the reason for the fracturing in globalization. So I guess maybe if both of you could comment on that, how do Grossman's arguments apply to the quite tumultuous situation we have in the global economy today?
I think
Michael, do you want to begin? Yeah.
I don't think they very much do apply. I think that must be Brian Green. It sounds like Brian. And obviously, Brian has done some very excellent empirical work on looking at the way in which the rate of profit has developed, particularly in the last couple of decades, as some of us have done as well. And the evidence is strong that as the profitability falls, it leads to the situation where at least stagnation, and perhaps followed by slump, is more than likely. We only have to look. I mean, there's often an argument being made by some Marxists that we had a great recession in 2008-9, yet the rate of profit was rising and profits were high. Well, first of all, profits may be up, but eventually they start falling. I've given the evidence actually clearly on the Great Recession of 2008-9. The rate of profit was falling from about 2005-6 down towards 2008, and the mass of profit then also came down. In the period before the pandemic, we saw a significant decline in the rate of profit, as Brian has just described there, leading eventually probably to a recession. If we hadn't had a pandemic in 2020, we probably would have had a slump anyway. And the law of the tendency of the rate of profit would have applied through a fall or decline in the growth of mass of profits. And I think we can say that now. We're beginning to see at the end of 2022 a significant downturn now in the mass of profits. The rate of profit has not recovered since the pandemic slump in any significant way. So it seems we're going to have a new slump in 2023, only 3 years since the pandemic slump. So I think the period of the 21st century has been a complete vindication of Grossman's work and of Marx's explanation of the theory of crises from the evidence that we can see at the moment. We're entering a significantly difficult period for capitalism, and that's demonstrated. So if the guys out there watching this, where do we measure the health of a capitalist economy? How do we measure the health of a capitalist economy? Is it doing well? Is it doing badly? Look at its profitability. Look at the profits. That's the key to giving you a guide to the direction it's going. It's the best guide of all.
Rick?
Brian in the YouTube chat connects this with what he calls the fracturing and globalization. And I think that's appropriate, because with the declining rates of profit, inter-imperialist rivalry increases. And I think that is something that we are definitely seeing at present as well. Grossman has essentially alternative theory of imperialism to that of Rosa Luxemburg, economic theory of imperialism to that of Rosa Luxemburg, and one that's superior to that of Lenin as well. And that is related to the question of the rate of profit and the way in which imperialism can allow particular national blocks of capital to sustain their rates of profitability, and often sustain their rates of profitability at the expense of other capital, state blocks of capital. And this is the case for monopolization. So if your state has colonies in which there are crucial raw materials, and these raw materials are not found in many parts of the planet, then you can charge much higher prices for those raw materials to other capitalists in other countries than in your country. This is an important aspect of imperialism, and we don't have formal colonies anymore, but we have a situation where there are spheres of influence and where the dominant capitalist powers are able to extract concessions from other states in their spheres of influence that can enable them to maintain a sort of a monopoly kind of a relationship. So I think that declining rates of profit and increases in inter-imperialist rivalry are things that go together. Now, that's not the entire explanation of inter-imperialist conflict. There are other factors as well, but it's an important underpinning, an important economic underpinning of the current global situation of international rivalries.
Can I add to that, Eleanor? I think that...
Yeah, go ahead.
Rick's absolutely right, because if everybody reads the book, some of the features that we talked about the theory of crisis, but I think Henryk Grossman's explanation of the economics of modern imperialism is one of the most superior explanations that we have. And he provides us with the key factors involved in that. But one of the two things spring to mind. First, when Lenin wrote his book on imperialism in 1915, he said, imperialism, we can see this expressed in the massive export of capital into the so-called third world by the imperialist countries. And Grossman says, yes, but why was there an export of capital? Why was all these capitalists trying to find new profits, new markets abroad? Because the profitability at home was under pressure. It was falling. That's what's left out of the equation in imperialism in Lenin, and which Grossman brings us back to. And the other feature was, he also shows how the process of that extraction of surplus value from the third world countries to the imperialist countries takes place through international trade, through the process of unequal exchange, and gives us the simple formula to explain that, which is, in my view, is an absolutely key theoretical model for us to understand the process of exploitation through imperialism, often missed in Marxist works, as far as I've seen, until fairly recently.
I might throw in another question for myself. We've talked a fair bit about the technical aspects of Grossman's argument. What are the political implications? It was touched on a little bit in the discussion, but to move towards the end of this session, maybe we could talk about that. What are the political implications of Grossman's crisis theory?
Well, it's possible to have all sorts of high economic theories combined with all sorts of political practice. That is perfectly possible. That doesn't necessarily imply inconsistency, although we human beings are quite capable of holding two inconsistent ideas in our heads at the same time. I think, though, that Grossman's approach underpins quite effectively, more effectively than underconsumptionist or neo-harmonist, that is, disproportionality theories of crisis. It underpins a revolutionary perspective on political change because of its emphasis on the intrinsic nature of recurrent economic crises. I mean, capitalism is marvelous in some respects, absolutely marvelous in terms of the improvement in the productivity of human labor. Capitalism has achieved absolute miracles. You compare late 18th century means of communication by post using boats or horses. And I waved my mobile phone at you if it showed up. Well, it's sort of showing up a bit. And this particular mode of communication, an absolute miracle. I mean, it's pretty much magic compared with my youth, let alone the end of the 18th century. So capitalism has dramatically increased the productivity of human labour, but it cannot guarantee a sustained improvement in the living conditions of the mass of the population, because there are periodic economic crises which plunge huge numbers of people into poverty and distress. This is quite apart from the fact that in large chunks of the world, people have very, very low living standards. Even in the capitalist core countries, prosperity cannot be maintained indefinitely and consistently for the working class. It is necessary for a whole series of reasons, not least the fact that the planet is frying, to get rid of this system. But even in terms of its intrinsic nature, the way in which capitalist production is organised, it's necessary to get rid of it because of that contradiction at the heart of the system between increasing productivity of human labour associated with falling rates of profit which generate recurrent economic crises. So I think that that's a link between Grossman's high economic theory and a political practice that sadly a too small proportion of the left today is pursuing. That is a practice that identifies the importance of working class self-emancipation achieved by smashing the capitalist state.
Just before I pass to you, Michael, encourage people, if you have any questions, to put them in the YouTube chat. We can continue this discussion for some time longer. So if people are sitting on any questions, definitely post those in the chat now. Did you want to comment, Michael, on the...
I just wanted to say that if we go towards the end of the book that Grossman has, he deals with the question of, he's outlined an economic model for the basic contradictions of capitalism, which means, as Rick said, it cannot meet the needs of humanity on a consistent basis. We have a series of crises and slumps which of ever increasing intensity, and that the vast majority of the world's population is not in a state of overwhelming prosperity, but struggles to survive, to meet ends, and inequalities remain wide. So he points out the objective economic nature of this. But that doesn't mean to say he doesn't recognize, and as we know historically, Grossman was an activist, that he doesn't recognize that it's not going to break, capitalism is not going to break down and then be replaced by socialism in some sort of automatic process. It requires the active participation of the working class to bring about that change, because the alternative is barbarism. If you want to use that very short word, it means that we could go backwards. There is no reason why we couldn't go back from our mobile phones to the horses and the pigeons. And in some ways, you could say that when the Roman Empire collapsed, it's a matter of historical argument that we went, all the sort of technological gains that that empire achieved in irrigation and other things disappeared, collapsed in the period of the so-called Dark Ages. It's perfectly possible that if the working class doesn't succeed in transforming society and bringing about the possibility to move towards a new form of human organization on a socialist basis, that we could go back into this a period of really, well, it will be horrendous. I mean, the planet is getting horrendous. Humanity could join it unless we can change it over the next generation.
And a question now from Steve Lee. Does declining profitability also drive deeper divisions in domestic ruling classes? In the US, we see sharper division within the ruling class today.
Well, yes, declining profitability leads to, in a purely economic sense, a greater desperation in economic competition amongst capitals. And it can lead to different perspectives on how to deal with the problems that they face, different perspectives on how the state should be acting. In the US, certainly, there are significant divisions inside the ruling class today. These cannot simply be explained, I think, in economic terms. I mean, in important senses, there is a consensus inside the US ruling class about containing wages, projecting US international interests, including by military means. The divisions inside the ruling class can only be in the US, well, the divisions in US politics between the main representatives of US capital, the Republican and the Democratic Party, have to be understood in much more immediate conjunctural terms as well. The way in which different class forces are being mobilised to support the two, one or other of the two parties, and particularly the way in which an increasingly desperate middle class, petty bourgeoisie, and to some extent elements in the new middle class have been harnessed to a particular political project by Trump. Now, the desperation of those layers who are affected by capitalism's problems are economic in an important way, but the way in which they're mobilised is something that's political, that has to be examined in a very concrete, empirical fashion. And the way in which the Republican Party has, to a significant extent, moved dramatically to the right around an erratic and often irrational figure of Trump, that is something that has economic roots but cannot be explained simply by using some of Michael's excellent graphs. Those graphs are crucial, but we need to undertake a political analysis of what's going on, and particularly a class analysis of what is going on in the United States as well.
I would like to perhaps tentatively suggest that we can use the graphs to develop some political responses. For example, in the period when the profit was high, the so-called golden age, after the end of the Second World War up until the mid-60s, this is a period of strong expansion for capitalism. Profitability is high, investment was high. That was also a period of an expansion of the labour movement and its strength, and a certain level of agreement between social democratic leaders and the ruling class that they could work together. They all talked about, the tripartite negotiations. Back in Britain, the union leaders used to go into the prime ministers, have beer and sandwiches to discuss policies, things like that. There's no way that happens now. So this was a period when capitalism was relatively healthy and was able to concede certain things rather than have industrial conflict and other forms of class conflict. But in a period of falling profitability from the late 60s through to the early 80s, that was a period of intense class conflict and also confusion amongst the capitalist class about what policies to adopt. All the Keynesian policies of macro management, I was saying before, communications and discussion with the workers was dropped for outright vicious anti-working class and anti-policies designed to weaken the welfare state and so on. And also the expansion of globalization around the world to exploit the rest of the world. In the period of the 80s and 90s, it's called by conventional economists now the Great Moderation. Because of the recovery of profitability to some extent, suddenly we were told that capitalism was doing okay, productivity was up. We had a lot of the new inventions that Rick was talking about. And so capitalism had a sort of a period, if you might call it, of relative recovery. Yes, it was a neoliberal and anti-trade union, anti-welfare state environment, but it didn't reach the intensity of class conflict, which you're beginning to see now in the 21st century when profitability started to fall again. So I'm only giving a crude idea that we can look at the changes in the tendency of the rate of profit to fall and its direction it's going on to give you a feeling about the intensity of the class conflict that arises from that and what capitalist policies are adopted to deal with the situation. Things are going well, they're all very friendly to some extent. If things are going badly, they're vicious, particularly against the working class and against each other.
All right, we've got another interesting question here from Jared Brewster, who has asked, is the reason for some rejecting the theses of the rate of profit to fall and the labour theory of value due to the attempt to fit Marxian economics to the methods and scope of bourgeois economics?
Definitely.
I think that's right. I'd put it slightly differently.
Yeah.
There has been a tendency, especially amongst those who are concerned to make careers in economics departments, despite their radical politics, to assimilate aspects of mainstream economics. And that includes a harmonist perspective, the assumption that there is a tendency for equilibrium to be established in the economy. And really that's at variance with Marx's approach. It's at variance with a theory of capitalist operation based on the labour theory of value. So I think that I wouldn't accuse all critics of Marx's theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, of falling into this trap. But I think that there is an element of truth in this. And one illustration of this is the way in which the work of a Japanese Marxist, Okishio, in the 1960s was regarded as having refuted the tendency of the rate of profit to fall because it didn't make sense for capitalists to engage in investments that would make their rate of profit fall. And this was based on a harmonist, simultaneous analysis drawn from neoclassical economics. That is, in neoclassical economics, time really doesn't feature. Economic developments occur more or less instantaneously. And it's true that no capitalist is going to invest in technologies that reduce their own rate of profit. That's perfectly true. The problem is that you can invest in increase your organic composition of capital. And if you are a leader in your sector, this will improve your rate of profit because the productivity of the workers that you employ increases. You are able to, and therefore you're able to produce whatever it is you're making more cheaply, and you'll be able to undercut your rivals and increase your market share and increase your profitability. You'll be able to sell under the price of your rivals, but still above the level of the average level of the rate of profit. The problem is that initial incentive means that other capitalists, if they're going to stay in business, have to follow you. And when they follow you, the overall average value embodied in that commodity falls, and the price of that commodity will fall. And overall, the rate of profit will fall, including for you, the innovator. So the time factor is absolutely crucial in understanding this tendency for the rate of profit to fall. And it's something that Okishio simply did not appreciate. But you still see Okishio cited by quite impressive people in their critiques of Marx and of Grossman.
I think I'd add to what Rick said that it's that period when in the post-war period, in the golden age, when capitalism was doing relatively well, rate of profit was high, a lot of Marxists actually accepted the Keynesian theory that macro management of the economy worked and that profitability was irrelevant. What mattered was aggregate demand and whether you were keeping that under control. And therefore, in their minds, particularly as conventional economists were providing so-called refutations of the labour theory of value, that the labour theory of value was no longer relevant, was wrong, and that the tendency of the rate of profit to fall was irrelevant and not relevant to the nature of a capitalist economy. And a capitalist economy could work if there was sufficient management of the economy. So theoretically, we got developments of people who were considered Marxists denying the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Some of the key Marxist economists at the time, like Paul Sweezy and others, wrote their works which specifically excluded the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall as being relevant. That particular strain of thought continues. It hasn't disappeared. There are people still presenting that point of view today, that it's not relevant to a theory of crises. But that's, I think, a product of that particular period when it appears that capitalism was doing relatively well. In the period when it wasn't doing so well, in the 70s and 80s, we began to see a change in the attitude towards the understanding of capitalist crises, and that's why perhaps the positions of Marxist Volume 3, Grossman's work, Rudolsky's work, other people's work who supported that theory gained more prominence. And in the latter part of this the 20th century, we had a number of excellent works by Marxist economists which showed the logical consistency of that theory, and both the Laddie theory and the law of the tendency rate of profit to fall, and that it wasn't illogical, as Akishio said and others said, who advised that theory, and that we could present ourselves with a perfectly logical, consistent model based on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. All we had to do then, at least in my view, was show it was empirically valid, which was that we've spent the last 20 years trying to do.
I've got another question as well. I know it's often talked about as though Grossman recovered this theory from Marx's Capital and repopularized it. But why was it lost? So there were many students of Marx and students of Capital in the time and preceding when Grossman was writing, all going back to Capital to develop their own theories, for instance, about imperialism and so on. So is there any idea as to why this thing in particular, which seems to be a fairly crucial argument, that capitalism has an inherent economic tendency to break down over time, about why that was not taken up until the mid-late 1920s?
Well, I think Michael's point that there are lots of people who didn't read Volume 3 of Capital is true. It's also the case that there's not simultaneity in the appearance of the 3 volumes of Capital either. Volume 3 is only published in 1894 after many years of effort by Friedrich Engels to work up Marx's drafts. So that there is less time to assimilate the messages of Volume 3 of Capital. Also, underconsumptionist theory in particular has a certain popular appeal. You're not paying workers enough. Crises are happening because you're not paying workers enough. Pay workers more. Now, the conclusion, I think, is correct. Pay workers more because they deserve it. They create value. That is true. But the argument that this will overcome crises or prevent crises is a mistaken kind of an argument. And that underconsumptionist argument had a long-term currency inside the labour movement. It's maybe it's also a question of who dealt with the issues of crisis in what order. So Kunoff, a German Marxist economist, was probably the first to deal with the question of crisis theory in the 1890s. And he essentially had an underconsumptionist theory. And what Grossman argues, and I think he's right, is that Luxembourg essentially took it over. And so did Karl Kautsky, who had phenomenal influence, not only inside the German social democratic movement, but amongst Marxists on a global level. He essentially had, initially at least, an underconsumptionist theory of economic crisis. So yes, it's an interesting question, and I think my answer is only a partial one.
Partial it may be, but I don't think I've got anything to add to what Rick said, because that's the way more or less I see it. And you might say it's difficult to understand, Eleanor, when it's staring you in the face in volume 3, but apparently it was difficult to understand by a whole layer of leading theoreticians in the social democratic movement prior to the First World War. And in the post-war period, I've done what I'm talking about here, post-1945, I said it didn't pick up anything amongst Marxist economists at the time. They had not only they ignored the law, or they considered it logically inconsistent to go with the theory of value to some extent, and so it was lost as part of the theoretical contribution that Marx has made to the basic theory of crisis. When we started this discussion, I reminded myself of some of the people who've written books. Recently, sadly deceased Simon Clarke wrote a book called The Theory of Crisis, which is really very good in many ways. It outlines the nature of crises under capitalism, but it's clear from him, if you read that, it's very good. He says basically that the rate of profit is just one small factor. It's not really relevant particularly, and there is no real theory of crisis, and that's what happens. None of the leading theoreticians, Marxist economists in the social democratic movement prior to 1914 or since, still that strain is saying that there is no theory of crisis. Marx didn't have one. It was a mishmash. You need a compendium of different things: underconsumption, disproportion. Well, somebody said that to me the other day. It's actually underconsumption, disproportion, deregulation, and profit. Add them all together, mix it up into some sort of bake cake, and that's your theory of crisis if you want it. I don't think it's really a superior alternative.
Well, I guess I'll ask if either of you have any final comments that you wanted to make, something that you want to expand on from the discussion or hasn't been raised yet.
Well, I'll let Rick finish up, so I'll just say that I think I'm sure everybody's read the books originally in the previous one, but this is the full version. So all the extra material in there, and with Rick's excellent introduction, every time Rick gives you clarity on the question of what Grossman's saying, and there's more in here than existed in the previous version, which I've been hanging on to for many a year. Looks a bit dog-eared. But as I say again, it's not just a question of theory of crisis in the book. There are lots of other things in there on imperialism, on the way in which economies operate within national economy, let alone internationally, that are really major contributions to our understanding of the world economy and capitalism in the 21st century. I'll say again, this is an indispensable book for everyone. If people haven't read this book who are still with us at this time of night in the UK, then they certainly should first thing tomorrow start.
This first full translation also has the Grossman's concluding chapter, which is not simply a summary of what went before. He makes important additional points that sadly was not in the earlier abridged edition. Rosa Luxembourg said that Karl Marx was way ahead of the maturity of the workers' movement in terms of an understanding of capitalism. And it was only as the workers' movement matured that it was able to wield many of the insights in capital as weapons in workers' struggles against the system. And I think that's true. And I think that Marx's argument in volume 3 of Capital was also way ahead of the workers' movement and of the left in his day, and really through up until Grossman, and sadly, to some extent subsequently. I am hoping that the maturity of the workers' movement's not in a great state in the main centres of capital accumulation at present, but I'm hoping that the maturity of the left across the world, not only in the main centres of capital accumulation, but across the world, that level of maturity is such that now the lessons that Grossman recovered from Marx and Capital, that those can now be assimilated into the armament of the left in its struggle against the capitalist system.
Okay, well, thanks again to Rick and Michael for your insights today. And thanks also everyone who has tuned in, be it early morning or late in the evening, and participated in the Q&A. Finally, just once more, I'll encourage everyone to get a hold of this book. I don't have it right